So you've heard a more powerful introduction to why we would do climate change than I could ever give. This year's Dean's Distinguished Lecturer will be speaking on this topic, Dr. Richard Jackson. He's a pediatrician with a degree in public health who just a few years ago spent some time in India with the World Health Organization on smallpox eradication. When we were going through his bio, I was thinking, actually, Dick, you have had so many careers and so many really, truly extraordinary areas you've worked in. He had numerous roles in the California State Department of Health Services. He then went on to spend nearly 10 years at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, including as director of the National Center for Environmental Health and senior advisor to the director of the CDC. And that's all before joining academia, serving on the faculty at UC Berkeley, at Michigan, and then we're so thrilled that you came to find your home here at UCLA. So here he has chaired the Department of Environmental Health Sciences and mentored numerous students. And lest you think we took a very big risk naming him the Dean's Distinguished Lecturer, you just have to get a few of the titles of the other awards he's received over the years. Presidential Distinguished Service Award conferred in 2005 by the President of the White House, in the White House. The American Institute of Architects elected Dick as an honorary member, one of their highest honors for non-architects. He received the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services Award for Distinguished Public Service. He's been elected to the Institute of Medicine, and we could probably spend all afternoon just on his awards. But I will end there and just say that given that the World Health Organization has clearly called climate change one of the biggest threats to human health, I am delighted to introduce Dick Jackson to give this year's distinguished lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jody. Oh, talk about a hard act to follow. Those and you, students, are magnificent. You are what gives me hope when I get really deeply depressed looking at some of the things I'll be talking about today. So thank you so very much. I actually met Dr. Hillary Godwin at a climate change and health event we were organizing, I did for the Institute of Medicine in the Presidio. We took an immediate dislike to each other. It turned out that Hillary was coming down with pneumonia and ended up in the hospital for 10 days after that. And I was managing the thing with a bunch of stray cats, including Jonathan Fielding. And everybody got up and spoke too long, so I kept kind of push people off the stage and keep moving the thing on. But we have become great friends, and she didn't take credit for this. She was elected the top teacher at UCLA. Her picture is in the hallway going into the faculty club. There aren't many of these, and I just want to commend Hillary, and she's been just a terrific mentor to all the students. I don't know where she gets her energy. To prepare for this, I did do a bit of homework, Deborah, and thank you so much, and Doctor, thank you so much for all of this. When I started work at the State Health Department of California in the late 1970s, I had been a pediatrician at UCSF. Phil Lee was the chancellor at the time, and I saw kids clustering, and they would come in from the Central Valley with neural tube defects. And then a couple weeks later, we'd get a cluster of gastroschisis. And I kept thinking, I wonder if there's chemicals in use in the Central Valley. And so even though I had done CDC and infectious disease, I thought I really want to work on environmental health. There's another reason, which is I'm a Jersey guy. And if you're from New Jersey, environment is in our DNA, and we figure, oh my God. I got a job working at the State Health Department across the street from the Public Health School in Berkeley, doing environmental epidemiology, particularly focused on farm workers, particularly on very challenged populations. And I was given a desk, and someone said to me one day, oh, That's the former director's desk. That was Les Breslow's desk before Ronald Reagan fired him and moved the health department to Sacramento. And only a few people that claimed they were laboratory people could stay in Berkeley. Deborah's nodding her head because she knows this story well. And so I heard lots of stories about, Lester, and one of my professors said, well, he's kind of a crackpot. He thinks that, eating breakfast and not having a cocktail and exercising is good for you. And I didn't know Les at the time. And I got to know and respect him over time in the wonderful study that was done. But I particularly like, as I read the obit, that he had ideas that were seen as bizarre at the time. And as we think about climate change, those bizarre ideas are probably exactly what we need to be doing. I'll skip this because it says it already. After doing environmental health for a dozen years in California, I got a chance to go to CDC and became head of environmental health for the country. And I worried about things very, very small, atoms and molecules, or atoms of lead, molecules of endocrine disrupting substances. But the more I learned about climate change, the more I resolved I will never give another talk that doesn't include climate change. And I'll tell you, there were times in front of Congress and in the southern United States where that was a difficult resolution to adhere to. And to the point that at one point we had prepared 14 pages of testimony for Congress, requested testimony for Congress. We had to send it up for clearance. It clearly went through the White House, and the 14 pages were reduced down to 3. And shortly after the Bush administration came in, they took my 11 advisory committees, each one of which had 12 people on it, and removed half the people on those advisory committees and gave me, as chair of the overall advisory committee, the vice president of the Heritage Foundation. I am not joking. I did have the misfortune of mouthing off to the wrong person at some point. They found a way to move me out of that job as head of environmental health. They then gave me the Distinguished Service Award in the White House. But I have a theme here for the students. It's not about science. It's often about politics. And a lot of the displacement of people is political, the things that go on. You've seen this graph, but I'm going to mention how when Dr. Breslow took over chronic disease at the health department, the planet's CO2 was 310 parts per million. When my children were born, it was about 340 parts per million, and we just hit 400 parts per million. This is not geologic time. The rapidity of this has been amazing. In fact, that's one of the big lessons around climate is the scientists have been mostly right, but they've been wrong about one thing. It's going much, much faster than they ever predicted it was going to happen. This is real temperatures taken around the Earth, ocean and land, for the last 140 years. Lester was born here. He was born in actually a very cold year in the history of the planet, at least in the last 150 years. Look at the temperature increase. We're already at about 1.5 degrees Celsius since he was born. You've seen this slide earlier, but the fact that not one of our students has ever lived in a colder than average year, if the norm is the last 150 years. Not 1 year colder than average in their entire lifetimes. We think about the air getting hotter, but the fact that the ocean is containing enormous amounts of heat, and this 10 to the 20 joules, it's called, I had to look it up, 10 sextillion joules, but that the quantity of energy is being contained in the ocean, and that is being moved in the atmosphere, which means when you have more atmosphere in the ocean, you have more violence in the atmosphere, more moisture that comes at individual times, and we tend to ignore that. But the other part of the ocean is the sea level rise, and I apologize for not doing that slide better, but we're probably wrong in how fast the sea level rise is going to occur. But this one amazed me. You know, I have a little grandson, Finn, and he likes to look at the globe, and we spin the globe, and he holds the globe up to me one day and goes, "Grandpa, look, you can look at the globe and not see any land, because if you turn it in a certain way, you just see the entire Pacific to the south." That the top mile of the ocean the pH has dropped. Can you imagine how much CO2 is going into the ocean, the carbonic acid that's being produced, and the change in the pH of the oceans, not to mention the CO2 being dissolved in the ocean? We all know that the Arctic sea ice is declining, but in Lester's lifetime, it went from 100 square million kilometers down to 6. I'm sorry, from 10 to 6. So that's a 40% decrease in one person's lifetime. You've seen this slide, but this is a different slice. This is just wintertime compared to previous years. And they draw two circles. These are the hot spots. These are, maybe this is the future agriculture, the Yukon and Alaska and northern Siberia, but this really is a setup for lots of thawing of the permafrost CO2 release. But I want to point out this one. It's really hot on this huge ice mass up here. And what's this? Why is there that big cold spot at the top of the North Atlantic? It's not supposed to be cold at the top of the North Atlantic. It's because the equivalent of 4 Mississippi rivers is pouring into the North Atlantic with brilliantly cold, clear, former ice of the last 200,000 years. It's just dissolving and pouring into the Atlantic, both through the moulins that drop down to the base that helps the ice move more quickly, but also into the ocean itself. This is a big deal for another reason, which is the Gulf Stream moves because of saltwater circulation. So if the Gulf Stream decides it's not going to keep moving, we're looking at Northern Europe becoming as cold as Northern Canada, very, very rapidly. So the movements of populations are the things, I worry about a lot of things, but this movement of populations is a desperate political issue at the same time. This is IPCC report 2 years ago saying, oh, we're looking at 0.5 to 1 meter by the year 2100. And in the last week, this Nature article came out and challenges that once more, saying you're underestimating and you're really probably looking at 1 to 2 full meters. A good part of New Jersey and a good part of Florida is gone with 1 to 2 meters. Again, movements of population and moves. And I apologize to the students for being so US focused, but it's been my career in California focused. I was pleased that President Obama has flown out here this very day and has released this report this week in our honor. And so Lester would be very pleased to know this. But I have 2 thoughts on this. This is the summary slide of all things. First of all, I think the most important thing is this one. Traumatic events like disasters, disaster grief, and huge moves of societies over time. I think science and other things can deal with some of the others, but that's the one that, because I had the refugee disaster group under me at CDC, so I've been in the middle of a lot of this stuff. The other thing that disturbed me about this report is public health is not adequately present. All the technical agents are all over at agencies, but we're not seeing public health present enough in the report as it's being forwarded. And I sent a blistering note to Tom Frieden, the head of CDC, after he did the Shattuck lecture, the big lecture at Massachusetts General about the big threats to public health, and he talked about tobacco and obesity, and I completely agree with tobacco and obesity, but he never talked about climate change. And oh my God, these are the countries that produce the most CO2. I won't get into methane. I think California wins that one. But you can see they're made fat because they produced a lot of CO2. It's a sort of density equalizing cartogram. Which countries do you think will see the most morbidity and mortality from climate change? So if the Himalayan ice cap begins to disappear and the Ganges stops flowing much longer portion of the year, if the Brahmaputra also stops flowing and the Sea of Bengal comes up another meter or 2, 180 million people in Bangladesh are not going to be able to grow rice and they're not going to be able to live there. We're talking about population migrations that will be unprecedented in the history of the world. So the head of the Senate Environment Committee is a fellow physician. I'm ashamed of him. He denies the presence and the reality of climate change. He actually walked into a hearing with a snowball and threw it to the members of the committee saying, see, there's no such thing as climate change, and criticized the US military and the Pentagon for saying we have to begin to prepare for mass movements of populations. And the term they use, and it's pretty amazing, is a threat multiplier. That threats that are this big, when you start adding this to it, become far, far larger. These are very serious people. The mother of all risks in national security was one of the terms from a later report. So I did a PBS series on the built environment and health, and want to thank a bunch of foundations, including a bunch in Michigan. And one of the lines I used, it's sort of an offhanded way, I said it in an interview. I know how Bernie Sanders feels sometimes because I kind of tossed out this comment. I think we're guilty of generational child abuse. And then I did my homework and realized we're not guilty of generational child abuse, we're guilty of generational child neglect. Child abuse is physical, sexual, and psychological. I don't think we're doing that to our children and grandchildren, but the student that made that point, maybe not far off. But child neglect, physical neglect, medical neglect, educational neglect, inadequate supervision, and exposure to violent environments, we as a society are guilty of this when we're failing to address these issues. So we need to work across multiple domains, and here are 5 big ones, and I'll go quickly through how we can sort of, instead of have threat magnifiers, but have benefit magnifiers. The Paris Accord is crucial and wonderful, but it's a little focused on big-time engineering and other changes, but it's a good thing. You've alluded to this, Jody, in your comment. When I was a young pediatrician, I never saw a child with type 2 diabetes. I'd be in the clinic week in, week out, never saw one. Half the kids in the clinic now have type 2 adult onset diabetes, and their life expectancies are lower than the kids with type 1. And so what we're doing with our nutritional patterns and removal of physical activity from our lives is really a worry. Here's an Haynes comparison. You already alluded to this, so I'll take it out. But the fact that 50% of Californians, and one of our own faculty did this, have either pre-diabetes or diabetes is just shocking, and we will begin to harvest the effects of this. This is the Haynes study that I found just stunning. Here's a comparison of people in the prime earning years of life, 46 to 64, 2 decades ago, in the last couple of years. Do you think health's gotten better or worse? Here's Haynes 20 years ago. Excellent health, up or down? That's a big deal. When people know how healthy they are, and if they say I'm in excellent health and you go to 13%, can you go about your life without help? A relative increase of 50%. Do you need a cane or a wheelchair? Think how the costs of that socially. More than a doubling. 7% of people in their 50s needing a cane or a wheelchair. You know smoking went down, you know obesity went up, but you didn't know this one, I don't think. We physicians have been wagging our fingers at people for 20 years saying exercise, walk, exercise. Look at this. More than half the population gets no physical activity. What's this got to do with climate change? I'll tell you in a minute. David Ludwig just came out with this in the JAMA in the last 2 days, but this is the first time in my lifetime we've seen an increase, in death rates for specific diseases, chronic diseases like heart disease, diabetes, liver disease, and stroke, jumping up this much. So we're beginning to harvest these effects. So what are the treatments? This is when I was a Secret Service man guarding my boss, but the larger point here is it's on the west steps of the Capitol, and it's about California produces half the fruits and vegetables. We spend $14 billion a year in price supports on corn, soy, and things that people don't need to eat so much of. And we spend nothing on price supports on things that people absolutely need to eat. So changing farm policy is a big thing in the right direction. And by the way, we'd reduce CO2 if we were growing a lot more farm stuff near crops. We have got to stop turning prime farmland into housing and subdivision. We probably need to pull them out. I was in Salinas recently, and they're just beginning to pave it over, and there's parking lots. It's the best farmland in the world. It's just tragic. The same thing is happening north of Philadelphia. All the Bucks County land, the Amish, they're selling it out and putting in these huge auto auction lots over and over again. People need that land for food. And don't think that we can grow tall greenhouses with hydroponics to get the food we need. It's not going to work. We've got to stop taking out about 1/6 of all the greenhouse gas increases due to removal of tree cover, removal of photosynthesis, and we've got to figure out how to build physical activity back into our lives. Most Californians, even though we spend a lot of time like this, we don't really enjoy it that much. I've been lucky enough to be the lead on the built environment for the campus, and campus is really, the administration has made a big commitment to make this a bicycle-friendly campus. They've tripled bike parking. They've put in green routes. There's green paths. The stairways going up and down have nice bike alleys. It's not perfect, and the neighborhood's been unfriendly to these efforts. I'll leave it in that most polite way. The Surgeon General tells us to walk because it's good for our health, but it's also good for the environment. It reduces CO2. It's better to burn fat than it is to burn fossil fuels. Ciclavia. It's a wonderful social event, closed down a major boulevard, Wilshire Boulevard, Venice Boulevard. Thousands of people, 250,000 people turned out for this one. I love the caption of the news article, which was, gee, I biked all the way downtown. I met a lot of people I liked. The buildings were much more interesting than I ever dreamed. And I got there faster on a bike than I did in a car. And this is really, culture has got to go along with it. I talked about politics, but culture, the software's got to go with the hardware change. Now, people can say Americans will never be happy with this. So here are two cities that are exactly the same population. One is 10 times bigger, 30 times physically bigger, spread out than the other. Obviously, this one's going to have a much bigger carbon footprint than this one. Which one would you rather live in? Which one of our young people would rather live in? Well, one of these is Atlanta, with their carbon footprint in Atlanta is 10 times versus Barcelona. And most hip young people would rather live in Barcelona. So, all right, what are the solutions? One is it's got to be about economy. Every time you fly into Los Angeles, don't you look down at those endless warehouses everywhere and think, why aren't there solar panels on every single warehouse? This is crazy. Same is true in Florida and Arizona and other places. We could supply all the electricity we needed with solar, and solar, the cost is now almost at parity with, of course, with no methane, it'd probably be even cheaper than fossil fuel use, but it would put a lot more people to work. You know that big platform that blew out and put 500 million barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico? That platform cost $3 billion, only employed 11 people at a time. And we could employ that many people in 10 blocks if we started to really put an effort like this. So density is cheaper per person because it doesn't cost as much if people are living in urban areas rather than suburban areas. But we need to put capitalism to work for us. And when people are doing things we think it's stupid, we add a tax to it. So we add a tax to alcohol. We ought to add it to firearms, but we do it to tobacco too. This is British Columbia. Thank you. British Columbia did a carbon tax. They added $10 a ton for carbon dioxide in 2008. They increased it by 5 Canadian bucks every year. It's up to $30 a ton in 2014. It's revenue neutral. This is very important politically. So the government isn't, you're not trusting some politician with the money or some bureaucrat. The money actually goes back to the public. Fred Zimmerman and I are talking a lot about how actually having the money go to children more than to all of us. Because I benefited from all this stuff. I don't deserve the money, but 2-year-olds absolutely deserve the money because they're going to pay the dues for this. It's only 26 cents more a gallon. And it raised almost $1 billion in tax reduction. So do you think carbon use changed in British Columbia? Carbon use dropped 16% in BC per capita. It went up 3% in the rest of Canada. And I don't have the economy slide, but BC actually is the most prosperous province in all of Canada. It's way ahead of the rest of the place. So they haven't really been hurt economically. Jody, I don't know if you know this slide, but this stuns me. This is IMF. Maybe you wrote it, but I don't think so. $5.25 trillion in subsidies are paid by the world's governments to keep fossil fuel extraction going. I'm sure they're doing it as a military thing because they don't want to be dependent on somebody else. That's more money than all the world's governments and people spend on health care. By the way, Chevron has, and American companies alone have $14 trillion more fossil fuels in the ground that they don't want to fail to extract before these agreements go into place. It's a complicated slide, but essentially it's 6% of all the global GDP. 6%. What could you do with just one of those trillions of dollars? 6% of all the global GDP going to subsidies for the fossil fuel industry that's bringing us global warming. So happiness, because we want to fix everything. Money makes you happy if you're hungry, cold, isolated, and you have a toothache. But in general, once you get your basic life needs met, this is Americans, you don't get much happier with more money. So thinking, and the American answer is, you make more money, you get happier. It ain't true. In fact, the thing that makes us happy, by the way, the second most prevalent disorder in America is depression. The thing that, after my talk, you're really depressed. The thing that makes us happy is being around people we love. It's the social connectedness. It's being physically active. It's music, dance, and food. It's connecting with each other. And so how do we create those environments? Because that's a much better treatment for it than Zoloft. So here's one of my treatments, and here's a walk on the High Line in Manhattan with my grandchild. I liked it in part because I didn't have to hang onto his hand every second because it's scary to walk in New York. But for 20 blocks, I could see the Statue of Liberty over there. I could see the Empire State Building over there. And it was the most glorious time I had with him. It is now the High Line in New York is the 10th most visited tourist attraction in the whole world. So thinking that people don't want to walk, don't want to exercise because they're lazy, it's crowded. I'll skip this. Justice. I don't have a good set of slides on this, but I'll make it quick. California, and this was under David Roberti and Governor Schwarzenegger passed a Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act and putting money into a cap and trade fund. The cap and trade was then amplified under Governor Brown, and 2 other bills have passed. Anybody have any idea how much money cap and trade has generated in the last 2 years? This means that the energy companies have to pay for the fuel and pollution they're producing. $3 billion. And about 1/3 of that has now been dispersed to poor communities because of very good leadership saying, you know, poor people are going to bear the brunt of this more than anyone. And so some of it's about making people more resilient and helping them get more efficient refrigerators, insulation, things that create long-term benefits for poor families, but also beginning to create downtowns so people have what they need. And I don't like cap and trade. I think we should have a flat-out carbon tax, but it's the right thing to do in our political setting right now. Almost done. So I had a chance to go to New York. I got to be in Franklin Roosevelt's house for 3 and 4 months. I studied Superstorm Sandy. The storm is the only hurricane that went west when it came up the coast. There was only one other in the last 500 years. This is changes in weather patterns. When I talk to New Yorkers, seeing water pouring into the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, this would be around 34th Street, pouring into the tunnel, pouring into the Hudson tubes. This is the Hudson River going in, and pouring into the battery. It just was unnerving for them. They had never seen the entire bay just pouring into the subways. Many of the utilities were underground. Verizon had its switching stations and power plant all underneath the first floor of the Verizon building. The airports were, of course, completely submerged because they're quite low. 159 people drowned. This was in a prosperous place with lots of warning. Well, what's this? Why are all those cars parked there? Why? They must want to go somewhere. 250,000 cars destroyed. I mean, people are more important, but you get a sense of the scope of the destruction. I'll skip this one, the fires, and I'll skip this. There is a point to this one. Governor Christie decided he was going to rebuild the Jersey Shore just the way it was, and so he had people rush down, rebuild the boardwalks, rebuild the roller coaster, but you can't take salt-damaged high-voltage wiring and plug it in, and all of a sudden the boardwalk's burning at the beach. So the recovery has been a big deal. So here are preventive issues. Here's a giant bougie made out of Kevlar that they're going to stick in the tunnels to keep the water out of the tunnels the next time this happens. But, yeah, I know. And there are 100 different plans going forward, but here's one that I just find intriguing. The bottom of Manhattan, they call it the Big U. What are you going to do at the bottom of Manhattan? Here's the 100-year flood. NYU Medical Center is in that 500-year flood. The East River coming in. Well, they had a rebuild by design competition. The big point, the engineers, the architects, the designers, the meteorologists, the public health people are working together. And the person in the end is Mindy Fullilove, a psychiatrist, an African-American leader that speaks a lot about displacement. They really looked at all the options about what they ought to be doing. You can't read this, but I'm going to show you the next slide. This is one of the proposals I absolutely loved. What do you do with Lower Manhattan? People love Greenwich Village. Jane Jacobs wrote books about it. Robert Moses tried to tear it apart and just run highways and pave it over. What do you do? Well, this is we've got to commit ourselves to meaningful community engagement, fine-grained urban experiences. Robert Moses' hard infrastructure, Jane Jacobs' locally based, community-driven sensibility. So here's one of the proposals. Here, by the way, is the high water mark. So there's a big berm and a barrier to keep the water out of Manhattan. It would be covered with green space, and there'll be jogging trails all the way around it. And it will be a welcoming and green respite place for the people of New York. This is down by Stuyvesant Town. Here's the FDR Drive. You can see empty tennis courts on this side towards the East River. Here is now the berm being covered with jogging trails going all the way up, and access to the people of the city to green space. And now it's been completely converted to recreation space and places for people to be active. So in a way, we're creating health at the same time that we're trying to adapt to climate change. It's perfect, no, but at least captures the vision. So with that, we need to balance it all and try and create environments that work for everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for that extraordinary talk. I think we have time for one or two questions, and then we'll do the alumni inductees. Any burning questions or comments? Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. And actually, I have a problem, maybe not very related to your PowerPoint. It's that in 2014, the climate change conference in Paris, I noticed that why there are so many people from California attending that conference, even more than other countries.
You know, it was funny. They actually said that Jerry Brown was being treated like a leader of state, and people weren't paying any attention to the other Americans. And California's just, when I go to other states, people go, oh, California, you're just way ahead of the rest of the country. But those of us in California still feel like we've got lots to do.
There's just one other hand in the back. Yeah, over there.
Dr. Jackson, my question for you is, these are great ideas, but who's going to
Well, I guarantee you Ted Cruz and Donald Trump aren't terribly interested. You know, things don't happen unless you have the ideas first, and you've got to tee them up. I've endlessly in my career been told that there was no money, no money, no money until something goes wrong, and suddenly the politicians find 60 billion or umpty-ump billion to fix it. I remember listening to Dick Cheney one day say, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. So in a way, the truth is that we've got a shortage of good ideas, and maybe the big takeaway I have here is, and this is for the students, thank God you're coming. We really need you. You really have to work on condensing and projecting your ideas in ways that are just powerful. So I love the storm analogy. I love all the analogies you showed, because we need to teach salesmanship as much as we need to teach technical science.
Thank you so much.